Hi, I'm Ruth Singer from the University of Melbourne. Welcome to my talk. I hope you've been enjoying our panel so far. If you've been watching them in order, you're getting towards the end, and I hope that you're getting a good sense of what non-polyglossic multilingualism is and why it's interesting. I'd like to start my talk with an acknowledgement of country. I'm speaking to you today from Melbourne, Australia. Melbourne is also called Naarm. It's on the land of the Wurundjeri people, whose language is Woiwurrung. I'd also like to make visible the research partnership with Wadawurrung community in the north of Australia, which all this research presented here is grounded in, as a way to make the relations in this work visible to some of the people I've worked with over the last 20 years, including some of the other linguists. So I'm going to cover a few different things in this talk today. I'll start with conceptualizations of non-polyglossic multilingualism, just to frame the talk, and how the scope of research in this area is expanding and people are becoming more interested in language contact and language change. And then I'll talk a bit about some of the outcomes of language contact in Western Arnhem Land, where I do research. So to start with, what is non-polyglossic multilingualism, which is a term we've decided to use for this panel to sort of frame the discussions. Well, I guess where I started looking in this area was from working with people at Wadawurrung community and talking to them about their languages. And after a while, I started to realise that what was going on was quite unusual, at least in the Australian Indigenous context, and also around the world, really, although not at all unique. So at Wadawurrung community, it's a community of around 400 people. And people speak 9 different languages from 4 Indigenous language families. So the languages that people speak are quite different from one another. Some of them are where there is related languages or dialects. I've counted them as one language. So adults tend to be highly multilingual. So speaking 8 languages is not uncommon. And most children grow up speaking 2 or more languages from birth. So some of their main carers who they live with speak different languages to them from birth. And one of the main things I've focused on at Wadawurrung community is looking at the role of receptive multilingualism. This is a very common practice where one person will speak one language to somebody and they'll reply back in another language. So people use languages they prefer, and don't always feel like they have to switch to the other person's language, even if they can speak it. So people have often talked about this as small-scale multilingualism. And in Singer and Harris, we brought together some of these common features around the world that these kind of communities, these kind of speech communities seem to have. So small-scale multilingualism is generally understood as a type of societal multilingualism that supports many small languages. So in an area which has a lot of small languages, you may either have a situation where people keep somewhat to themselves in different villages, mostly to themselves and aren't highly multilingual, or more often you'll get a situation where people are highly multilingual. So the 4 features we suggested are: local languages have relatively small number of speakers. So there may be larger languages spoken, but they're not specifically associated with very local areas. Marriages across language groups are the norm. So this sort of sets up the situation for multiple languages to be used within each family or household. Commonly, you'll have reciprocal marriages between groups. So when people marry into a group, there'll be other people married in there already who speak their language across different generations. Also, highly multilingual repertoires are unremarkable, so people won't necessarily even comment on them. However, there are some issues with the term small-scale multilingualism, which is clearly related to the category small-scale societies, although not, it's not a connection that people often make directly. Clancy and Jenny Davis, our discussant for this panel, have challenged the use of the category small-scale society. So as they and earlier anthropologists have argued, it's associated with the exoticization and romanticization of certain societies, which often obscures how colonization binds all societies together. So these are seen as separate and different to all the other societies, somehow independent, which is obscuring the binds between all societies. And something I think we'll see in this workshop, for example, in the previous talk by Jill Vaughan, is not just trying to look to the past, reconstruct the past, romanticize the past, but actually look at the present and see what's happening now in terms of newer engagements with colonial languages, and also how older relations are surviving within that. So the other thing that people identify with this small-scale multilingualism, which is a term I'm going to keep using despite mentioning its issues, is that there's no polyglossia. So the idea is that in the classic multilingual situation that's been written about a lot, there's a hierarchical relationship between languages. Some are seen as more important, less important, are used in more important domains, and that situation doesn't seem to exist between languages in context of small-scale multilingualism. Obviously, polyglossia does exist. For example, English has a special position in Arnhem Land, or in the Amazon, Portuguese or Spanish. But in terms of the focus of research on small-scale multilingualism, the focus is on relations between Indigenous people, rather than on their relations with regional government, national government, or colonisers. Most studies of multilingualism have focused on relations between Indigenous languages on the one hand and the dominant language, rather than on the dynamics of relations between Indigenous languages. So the aim of this research in small-scale multilingualism is to provide a counterpoint to that and say, yes, obviously this dynamic between Indigenous languages and the dominant language is important, and obviously it's what is driving language shift in a lot of areas, but the dynamics of relations between Indigenous languages is also important. And through shifting this focus, trying to find a new way to understand multilingualism beyond the dominant way of looking at it in terms of polyglossia, domain separation, so basically the Fishmanian approach. So studies of non-polyglossic multilingualism then could be a lot broader than just small-scale multilingualism. Is non-polyglossic multilingualism a synonym for small-scale multilingualism, or could it perhaps, as a relatively new term, be broader and encompass any situation where there isn't hierarchical relations between languages? One of the things that quite a lot of us work in this field have come to see small-scale multilingualism as a regional system. So it's a system that extends beyond each language or language group. You could just say it's a large-scale multilingual speech community, often in areas where population density is not very high. You have mainly Indigenous people. And so the speech community covers a large area, but possibly not that many people. What you find is there's things that happen that are larger than each language. So language ideologies, language practices, even cross-linguistic patterns of variation. So you may be getting a certain type of lenition or other changes happening across the languages because of this intensive multilingualism, rather than just in one language and then spreading to the other. The system extends beyond specific languages. It also extends beyond language itself. So the patterns of multilingualism are underpinned by regional socio-political frameworks. So these broader frameworks, I guess, explain how groups relate to each other and how they use their languages and one another's language. Within these regions, specific villages or communities may be more or less multilingual. So some may actually be more multilingual than others. But this idea of the regional system is also more than a Sprachbund, a linguistic area. It's not defined by linguistic features or by certain patterns of borrowing. So as Patty Epps puts it in her 2020 chapter, she talks about how there's an interdependency between the different communities and the languages they use. So after an initial burst of energy and enthusiasm for research on small-scale multilingualism, we're now getting to a sort of second phase where people are starting to think about new questions and look at new ways we could ask questions about non-polyglossic multilingualism. Initial studies focused on ideologies and practices. The practices that perpetuated the use of multiple languages in everyday contexts and the ideologies which underpin them. A lot of these researchers were linguists who had been working in language documentation, who started to think, well, actually, there's more than one language here, and just looking at one language is simplifying the situation and is somewhat artificial. And they started to look towards ethnographic methods from linguistic anthropology and qualitative sociolinguistics to try and get a better handle on what was going on. The emphasis in this research is on long-term collaborations with community members, often involving training of community members and co-authoring, because in a sense, to do this work well, you really have to engage much more closely with the community. You can't work on multiple languages and get a grip on local language ideologies just as a sort of lone researcher. Now what we're seeing is a sort of movement towards asking more questions about what are the consequences of these practices and ideologies. So in regions of small-scale multilingualism, do specific multilingual practices create conditions for different types of language change? So you can see here, I've skipped to the last two blocks in the diagram from the first two, and I've hopped over bilingual cognition, which is also a really important area to explore. And I've got some ongoing research in that area, but there's not that much to say about it yet. So in terms of language change and language contact, how might we identify the pathways for language change? So I'm just going to take a quick look at language contact in Western Arnhem Land between three languages. So I'm reconstructing contact between three languages. The Iwaidjan language Mawng, which is mainly spoken at Warrawee community and is associated with the island Warrawee, the next island, Waira, and also the coastline around there. And also Kunbarlang, which is associated with the next section of coast to the east of Mawng, and Kunwinjku, which is a variety of the Bininj Kunwok language group, a large group spoken by many people inland. So this is a larger map of Arnhem Land as a whole, just to show the four language families. So you've got the Iwaidjan language family up here on the Coburg Peninsula, of which Mawng is one. Then you've got the Gunwinyguan language family, which is a large family, of which Kunbarlang is one, and Kunwinjku is part of this Bininj Kunwok dialect group, this large patch of purple. Then there's the Mawng language family, which doesn't cover much area, but there's 4 different languages in there. And Gunwinygu, the Gunwinygu variety of Bininj Kunwok is a large language of the area. It's taken over from many of the other dialects of Bininj Kunwok to become the most used variety, with around 1,200 speakers. Most speakers of Mawng also speak Gunwinygu. So it becomes a bit of a lingua franca in some sense. Kunbarlang has few younger speakers, but it's fairly well documented, and there's still some speakers. Kunbarlang speakers usually also speak Kunwinjku or Gunwinyguan, two varieties of Bininj Kunwok, and often also speak Mawng if they live up Warrawee. So the first thing that strikes you with Mawng and Kunbarlang is that there's a number of unusual grammatical constructions which are found in both these languages. So one is the noun markers, or articles as they're called in Mawng, which agree in gender with the following noun. So for example, da gunak, the land gender article da precedes gunak in this Mawng expression. These are not really found in any other Indigenous Australian languages. There is gender prefixes on quite a number of Arnhem Land languages, but these, which really are separate words, as you can pause after them, are fairly unusual. Also, grammaticalized coverb constructions. So, for example, the main way to say I forgot in Mawng, ngaran pulangalk, involves the verb ngaran and pulangalk, which is a non-inflecting element that usually follows the verb. So these are actually widespread in some other parts of Australia, but not in this part of Australia. They're only found in Mawng and Kunbarlang. Also, very unusual reciprocal construction, the fossilized periphrastic construction. It's like if you say so-and-so did it so-and-so, and then so-and-so did it back to them, but you just drop that last bit back to them. So it's quite a long and convoluted way of expressing reciprocals. It's found in languages of the Iwaidjan family, so not just Mawng, also Iwaidjan and Kunbarlang, and it's very rare worldwide and quite unusual in the region where usually there's just a verb suffix for reciprocals. So there's a couple of unusual constructions that are common to Mawng and Kunbarlang. There doesn't seem to be any that are common to Mawng and Kunwinjku. And interestingly, the direction of influence in terms of these constructions seems to be Mawng to Kunbarlang, although obviously this is only clear with the reciprocal construction. But even the coverb constructions, in Mawng you have hundreds of coverb constructions, whereas in Kunbarlang you have less than 100, which suggests that they haven't had as much time to develop perhaps. So why is there sharing of these constructions between Mawng and Kunbarlang, but not so much Kunwinjku? Both Mawng and Kunbarlang were probably always small languages, less than 1,000 speakers, whereas Bininj Kunwok as a dialect group was probably bigger. Long-term reciprocal marriage arrangements seem to have supported intensive bilingualism, just based on what happens now, and also when people talk about their parents and grandparent generation and how marriages were arranged and the languages that they used. These are based on enduring alliances between certain Kunbarlang and Mawng clans. For example, some of them are part of the Mawng clan aggregate. We also expect more intermarriage and exchange between coastal groups with one another rather than with inland groups, although definitely people did marry inland groups. Because of the shared ways of life. So in fact, growing up on the coast, you're going to learn all the different ways of finding food and that kind of thing, which are relevant to being on the coast. And if you're living inland, it's going to be quite different. So even today, people talk about saltwater and freshwater people as significant cultural categories all around Arnhem Land. Lastly, why is there not more lexical sharing between Mawng and Kunbarlang? This could be because of the, sorry, that was meant to say receptive multilingual practices, not reciprocal multilingual practices. Receptive multilingual practices require a certain level of language awareness that where people monitor their speech to promote code separation and avoid code switching, although there is always a little bit. This kind of monitoring that people are doing of their language could reduce lexical sharing and lead to less borrowing. So if we're looking for unusual kinds of language change, how would we define that? If we want to ask whether certain kinds of language change are more common in small-scale multilingual contexts, how do we know if we found what we're looking for? In terms of current research on language context, it has not focused on these contexts. It's tended to focus more on contexts in which Creoles develop, mixed languages, and in diasporic migrant multilingualism. However, research in language context has identified what kinds of changes are more common or less common, and we're seeing more and more reports of fairly rare kinds of changes due to contact in context of small-scale multilingualism. One of the reasons it's interesting to look at language change is because it can help us decide if small-scale multilingualism is a useful category or if it's artificial and unnecessary. So we expect certain kinds of language change to be more common due to certain kinds of language practices and ideologies being more common.